Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yongki Hong. I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today's webinar will focus on E2 visa investor requirements and renewal considerations. I will be covering the first half of the presentation, and then for the other half, we are lucky to have our firm's partner Kelly Weiner. She will go over more specific examples and considerations. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer services in a wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, L1, H1B, and any types of employment or family-based green card cases. Especially, we have built very strong reputations for the E2 visa cases. We have processed thousands of E2 visa cases, and many of them were higher risk cases. And we have worked with the US consular offices all over the world. One of the reasons for this particular focus on E2 visa was because our firm itself was established on the E2 visa by our firm's founder, Ian Scott himself. And that's why we know a lot about the E2 visa world. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you several useful tools, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation that we'll go through today, a link where you could download the guidelines with more details on visa options, a link to sign up for additional webinars, a link to webinar recording on YouTube. We definitely encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post immigration related videos. And lastly, a link where you can sign up a private consultation with our team. Finally, for any questions, please type them into the chat box or Q&A box. We'll address all the questions at the end of the presentation. And with that, let's get started. So E2 visa is one of the probably best visas for the entrepreneurs. You have to be a national of a treaty country, and the currently United States have signed a treaty agreement with more than 80 countries. The list of the E2 countries occasionally change. Not that often, but likely a few years. A few countries would have been added, fall off from the list. So you should check the official E2 country list before you actually submit your E2 visa application. But keep in mind that you don't have to be born from the treaty country. You just need to hold a passport from the treaty country. For example, let's say you're born in India, which is not a treaty country with the United States yet, but later you immigrant to Canada and have a now Canada passport. Then you are eligible for the E2 visa. And you must own at least have 50% in E2 company ownership. So must be actively participating in the business operation, and you cannot be just passive shareholder for the E2 visa application. Okay. The next requirement is that you must make a substantial investment. Then what is a substantial investment? Well, we'll talk about it in more detail later, but generally speaking, it means a sufficient amount to make the E2 business fully operational. Funds must be at risk. This means you actually need to spend the money. You cannot claim an investment when your wire transfer funds are just sitting in your E2 business corporate bank account. The funds must be used before you submit the applications. Then the following question would be, how much investment is enough? We again will discuss more details later over this presentation, but generally speaking, the question you should ask is what kind of business you are starting and what are the reasonable startup costs for the type of business that you are operating. You also need to prove that investment funds are coming from the rigid source. For example, if your funds are, let's say, coming from a sale of property, then you will need to submit a signed contract, like closing documentations and bank statement showing the deposit of a net proceed from the transaction. For this matter, please keep in mind that government prefers to see very clear fund flows from the documentations. So you should try very hard to keep it simple and easy for the government officers to understand how the funds will originate from the beginning and came to the E2 business account later. Okay, the business also must be real and operating. It means that when you arrive in the United States with your E2 visa, your business must be able to immediately start operating, which means by the time you submit the applications, you have to show that your business is fully ready to operate the next day when you get an E2 visa. So which means website need to be up and running, and all kind of office equipment should be already set. So it's not like you are going to get an E2 visa first, then come to the United States to establish your business. It goes completely the other way around. Your E2 business should have been already established in order to apply and get approval for the E2 visa. To prove this element is satisfied, you will usually need to submit sign the commercial lease agreement, business entity registration document with the state government, and company website, and contracts may be signed with the customers, maybe any necessary licenses issued by the state government. There is also a marginality requirement. The whole point of the E2 business and the reason why U.S. government is giving E2 visa to you is like to create jobs in the United States and hoping that your E2 business will contribute to the local economy in the United States. So if the E2 business is barely making incomes just to cover your living cost, your family members' living cost, then obviously government would not like it. So therefore, it is very important that your E2 business should create enough incomes to hire US employees. You could even hire employee before you apply for the E2 visa. Such would actually strengthen your E2 visa case. E2 visa also requires that you have to have intent to return to your home country upon expiration of your E2 visa. The E2 visa is not a green card and does not automatically lead to a green card at all. It only allows you to enter the United States for temporary period to develop and run your E2 business. But it does not mean you cannot renew your E2 visa or obtain US permanent residency in the future. You could renew it, the E2 visa, and eventually you may go after for US permanent residency, green card, but you should carefully design the case direction with an immigration attorney or expert for the green card cases. So next slide. There are two ways to approach your E2 visa case. So one is to start your own business from the scratch. The second one is you could buy a business, existing business. The first option is basically you need to do everything from the scratch, that you have to register the corporation in the state department. You probably need to look for the locations and sign the lease agreement, and you need to do many things to have the business up and running. The second option, purchasing of existing business, is kind of a little convenience and will also have a way go around two ways. you can go to the sales before your E2 visa is approved, which will be riskier option because you already own the business, but you are not authorized to run it yet because you haven't applied for the E2 visa, but you already closed transaction. So you are owner of business, but you don't have authorization to run the business yet. So somebody else in the United States need to run the business for you while you are going through the E2 visa application process. Another option is the buying the existing business through escrow agreement. This means all the terms and conditions are all satisfied except the visa approval. So escrow agent will hold the transaction money, the purchase price, and once that he's confirmed that your E2 visa is approved, then he will release the fund to the seller. Okay, that's the second option to go around the purchase of business. However, if in the options, if E2 visa application is denied, the money will go back to buyer. So it gives you more protection and therefore attractive option. So how long is the E2 visa valid? It depends on the treaty agreement between the United States and the foreign country. It could be very short, like 3 months in Egypt, or 5 years. Uh, then what does that mean? If I get an E2 visa only valid for 3 months, then do I have to close down my business and leave the United States in 3 months? No. Regardless of the visa validity duration, you will typically get 2 years of E2 status when you come to the United States. So when you come to the United States, the CBP department, immigration officers at the airport, will issue a form called I-94, and which gives you the exact duration of stay you could stay in the United States. That's usually given 2 years, regardless of your visa validity. So you could run your E2 business for 2 years, but once you go out from the United States, you have to reapply and renew your E2 visa again if your E2 visa itself is shorter than the 2 years of E2 status. So please make sure to understand that the difference between visa and status. A visa is more like an admission ticket to the United States. So once you are inside the United States, your authorized duration of stays is not governed by the visa. The CBP's I-94 form will decide the duration. And for the E2 visa, the CBP officers usually give you only 2 years of duration of stay every time you re-enter the United States. So, for example, even if you have 5 years of E2 validity duration, you may need to make international travels at least a couple of times to renew your I-94 durations. Okay. So it is very important to check your I-94 record every time you enter the United States. So let's talk about how much investment amount is enough. This is a very common question though. Please keep in mind that there is no minimum set of investment amount in E2 visa world. In EB5, which is green card category, there is actual minimum investment amount set by the regulations, but that's not the case for the E2 visa. But you have to invest a substantial amount of money, and that depends on type of business you are starting. Okay, where because each council of post applies a slightly different review standard, and overall they kind of looking at very higher amount investment amount than USCIS. So that you have to realize how much fund is really appropriate for your business. The government also uses proportionality test. What it means is that if the startup costs for the consulting service is, for example, let's say $50,000. Then government wants to see you have, whether you have spent how much money out of the total $50,000 investment fund. And their standard will be the very high percentage of total investment fund because the startup cost itself is very low. So they want to see kind of high percentage of expenses. But another example, for example, let's say your business is a pharmaceutical factory, then which needs like millions and millions of dollars, then you could just invest lower percentage of total before you submit the application. Well, let's say factory needs total 5 million to fully establish, and you have only invested $1 million so far. That's only like 20% of the total required startup cost. But government officers will agree that such is substantial enough to meet the requirement. So if you are buying a business, you need to consider that whether purchase price you are paying is fair market value. Please note that the government does not like to see a situation where E2 investor is buying a business for like unreasonably low price. To demonstrate the purchase price reflects a fair market value, it is often very good idea to obtain a third-party business valuation report. For example, if valuation report concludes that business is worth around $100,000 and the contract also lists this purchase price as $100,000, then you are in very strong position for your E2 visa application. You also need to watch out for the seller financing situations, which is often problematic for the E2 visa case, and it is because you are not allowed to use the E2 business's assets as a security collateral. For example, you invested only half of the total purchase price and having the other half, 50% from the seller's financing. Then the government usually believes that you have not substantially invested in the business yet because the seller's financing is secured by the E2 business assets. Okay. Franchise are also a good option for the E2 visa case. It could be either you are buying a existing business, or you could start a new franchise business in a brand new location. This type of arrangement is good to provide that there is a proven business model and promise the future incomes based on the franchises already existing reputations like Dunkin' Donuts, Subways. You also need to think about where you are going to spend the money. And there are good and bad expenditures. There are certain expenses that are considered as stronger and some weaker. For example, travel expenses, hotel accommodation fees, meals, business meeting with vendors. These are considered as weak and bad expenditures. But purchase of computers, software, like leasing commercial office space, hiring employee and hire the employee's wage, those would be considered as very strong and good expenditures. Sometimes we get a question whether a home office is acceptable, and paying home mortgage is considered as a good E2 expenditure. We do not recommend a home office base for the E2 visa application. Although you can make an argument about it and why your business type does not need a commercial office space, governments does not typically buy this type of argument, and they have been very conservative about these particular matters. Okay. Next slide. Do I have to hire US employees? The answer is yes. The whole point of E2 visa, again, is to create jobs and contributing to the local economy in the United States. So if E2 business is barely making incomes to just cover you and your family members in a living cost, no, obviously they don't like it, and that's why you really need to create enough incomes to hire U.S. workers in the United States. So this means your application should prove that you are not going to operate your business as a solo owner and solo employee. Okay. We generally recommend that your business plan shows you are going to hire at least 3 to 5 full-time employees within next 5 years. You could even hire an employee before you apply for the E-2 visa, and such would actually strengthen E-2 visa application. Sometimes people ask whether there is a difference between W-2 employees and 1099 independent contract workers. Generally speaking, it is much better to have a W-2 employee for your E-2 business, but that also depends on type of business. For example, let's say you are in construction industry where hiring subcontractors are very common and usual. Then it is probably okay to pay their fees with the 1099 arrangement. But even if so, your construction business itself should at least have a couple of full-time W-2 employees. Okay. The point is that it is not good at all if your business E2 business only has 1099 contractors. If your business is a new business, then you can prove your intention to hire U.S. workers in the future by business plan. If you are buying an existing business, you will need to submit existing businesses W-2, pay stubs, and tax returns. So you should carefully choose which business you are going to buy. If the business didn't have any previous existing employees and only had a couple of 1099 contractors, then obviously those kind of existing evidence is not a good signal and indication that that's you are going helping your E2 visa application. So that's not a good candidate to buy. Okay. So with that in mind, let me turn it over to Kelly, who will guide you through the next part of our presentation. She will cover how to build up and improve your E2 visa cases. So please stay tuned.
Thank you. All right, so let's talk about some E2 visa business plan considerations. And the business plan is very important when you are kind of starting up a brand new E2 company, provides really key information. So there should be an executive summary. Who are you? What do you do? Who do you sell to? Who are your customers? Also market analysis and research. So who will be buying your products or services? A marketing plan. How will you reach out to your clients? A personnel plan. So 5 years of hiring projections, including job titles, job duties, planned raises, things like that. A comprehensive financial plan, which should include 5 years of financial projections with an income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow statement. All right, let's talk about some E2 visa considerations. So should you apply with USCIS or through consular processing? And USCIS filings would be a change of status. So this is only available to people who are already in the United States in a status that allows them to change status. So for example, if you've entered the United States on ESTA, you would not be able to change your status to get an E2 status. However, let's say you entered on a B1 as a business visitor, then you would potentially be able to change your status. Or if you're on an H1B and you want to start up your own company, then you might do a USCIS filing. If you do a filing with USCIS, the biggest benefit is that you're already in the US and you do not have to leave. You file paperwork with US Citizenship and Immigration Services. There is no interview. Everything is decided on the papers. Additionally, you can pay a fee to get a response within 15 business days. That response can be an approval, denial, or request for more evidence. If it's a request for more evidence, then they'll give you a final answer 15 business days after you submit a response. If you are approved, you'll get a 2-year approval notice. It does not permit you to travel internationally, though. So this is kind of the biggest benefit of going to the consulate is that you'll actually get a visa stamp in your passport that allows you to travel. And for many people, they can get a multi-year, multi-entry visa. So for example, Canadian nationals, UK nationals, they can get 5-year visas that allow them to travel in and out and run the company. So for many people, that's a more attractive option than a 2-year approval notice that does not allow for international travel. If you do a change of status, then and you leave the United States, before the E-2 approval notice date is up, you will not be able to re-enter on the basis of that approval. You'll have to go to a consulate, and they will look at it as a brand new case. So they don't have to rely on the approval of USCIS. Another thing to know about USCIS is one that they are more receptive than consulates to lower investment amounts. So maybe, if you have the type of business that would support it, like a service-based business, an investment, between $30,000 and $40,000 might work with USCIS, whereas that would be very, very difficult at most consulates to get that counted as a substantial investment. That being said, USCIS also has a very strict approach to the source and trail of funds for the investment. So let's say that you are investing money you've earned from your savings from employment over the years. At a consulate, you may be able to provide a few years of tax returns and proof of you transferring the money to the E2 business bank account. If you were doing a filing with USCIS, you would actually have to get much more detailed and show not only the tax returns, but your bank statements showing maintenance of the funds, showing receipt of the payroll. So for example, if you earned, $10,000 in a month, but you spent $10,000 in that month, they wouldn't consider that necessarily maintained. So it can be very complicated if you have a complex source of funds or one that kind of maybe you got money from a long time ago, and it's hard to track it or trace it. That can be very difficult for USCIS because they will ask for that amount of detail, whereas at a consulate, they take a much more high level view. Um, so we just talked about the source and trail of funds. So going into a bit more about that, loans are permissible for E2 investment, but they cannot be secured by the assets of the E2 company. So that's to say, let's say you're doing a purchase and they want to do seller financing, where the company is going, like you're going to put down 50% and then 50% is seller financing. So it is secured by the assets of the E2 business. That is not a good structure for an E2 because they likely won't consider that you have put, a substantial amount at risk if you've only put 50% of the purchase price down and the rest of it is secured, by the assets of the company. However, if you take out a personal loan, let's say you take out a home equity line of credit or an unsecured personal loan, that can be used for the E2. Gifts are also permitted. However, the gift giver must be willing to provide the financial documentation to show the source of the money. So let's say your mom is gifting you some money and she got it from selling a property. She would have to show the proof of the purchase sale agreement, her receiving the money from the property, maybe paying taxes on it. So, along with the gift letter. So gifts are good, but it's not a way to kind of get out of proving the financial documentation. You'll still have to provide that to the government. Um, so considerations for a small investment amount when you are applying and your investment amount is lower, so maybe under $100,000, so which would be considered quite low. It's very helpful to make sure that all the other aspects of the case are as strong as possible. And two things that can help here are one, letters of intent. So really showing this business has the ability to make money, the minute that it starts operating. We already have people interested in working with us. You can also have a CPA who works in your industry who writes a letter and says, I've reviewed the business plan, I've reviewed the investment, and based on my professional opinion, this is a reasonable, investment for this type of business. And that can be helpful as well. Um, E2 visas for two investors. So this is possible as long as each investor owns 50% of the business. If you have somebody who, wants to own 70/30, that can work if they have the same nationality, but then one person would have to be the investor and one would have to be an employee because they don't own, at least 50% of the company. Substantive changes to the business after filing. So sometimes people will get a visa and then they think, great, I have this 5-year visa to run a company. I'm going to start other companies. I'm going to do, whatever I want to business wise. And that is not permitted. So when you are, getting your E-2 visa, you're getting a visa to run the company that you, presented to USCIS or the consulate. So if you have a wedding photography business, and you want to close that down and start up a restaurant, you're not permitted to do that without first going to USCIS or the consulate and getting an approval for that substantive change. If the change is really not, a substantial change, so let's say, you're a wedding photographer and you're going to add, a blog, about wedding issues, that may not be something where you really need to go back and get, any type of approval. You also can consider contemplating different service lines in your business plan. So let's say that you want to do mobile app development, but that's going to take a while. So in the interim, you're doing software consulting services. In your business plan, you can indicate we're going to start the first 3 years doing software consulting services, and in year 4, we're really going to ramp up our mobile app development. And that can be another way that you can kind of avoid having to go back to the consulate. It is really important, though, to know that do not form new companies, without first talking to your immigration attorney or getting some type of approval, because the E-2 is entity specific. And so if you shut down your E-2 entity and start up a new one, this is a violation of your status. Higher risk cases. So there are certain industries that get a lot of scrutiny. So one would be real estate. There's a lot of concern that people are just going to buy some properties, collect rental income in a passive way, and it's not really going to be a real and operating business. So if you are doing a real estate based case, you want to make sure you're sensitive to that concern and you're showing this is really an operating business, whether it's property management business, real estate broker. If you're flipping houses, you want to be showing that you can do that on a large scale. And generally, that investment amount is going to have to be quite large because of just the cost of commercial real estate development or residential real estate development. Equity trading, also higher risk, kind of similar concerns to real estate. They're concerned, are you just day trading? Are you just putting your stock portfolio into an LLC? You really need to show here's how I'm going to earn the money. Here's, how it's going to support US workers. And, I have the licenses to do this type of work. If you have kind of like a hedge fund or something with a complicated structure, you want to make sure that that structure is clearly explained. And also it's a good idea to have the E-2 entity be the one where there's operational, activity, that's the one that hires the employees, that receives the revenue. That's the way you want to do for the E-2 company. Family business purchases. So if you are purchasing a business from a family member, it is something they're sensitive to, and you want to make sure that the purchase price makes sense in light of the financials of the company. So if the company is extremely successful, high profits, high assets, doing really well, and you're purchasing a 50% share for $25,000, they're going to look at that, with a lot of scrutiny and may not accept that that is truly the fair market value for the business. So it's a good idea in this circumstance to get a third party valuation, or have maybe a CPA do a valuation. You want some objective third party who is not a family member to look at it and say, yes, this is the normal purchase price, for a majority share or the total of this business. Right. So some common reasons for E-2 denials. So one would be low investment amount. So we do, kind of a lot of cases where, maybe $100,000 or under, which would be considered a very low investment amount. But there are some investments that are just too low. For example, we had a client who came to us and had spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in cash in a business bank account. And that amount it's just not enough to be considered substantial and show you've put, a substantial amount at risk, such that you'll actually, run the company. So if you do have a low investment amount and you have some cash, as working capital, this can be one of the easier denial reasons to overcome because you can spend more money. So in this circumstance, this client came to us. We helped, rehabilitate the application. This person spent $50,000 and had $50,000 in working capital and ultimately was approved. So with low investment amount, sometimes you will need to go back to the drawing board and spend more as part of your reapplication strategy. Nature of the business. So again, real estate equity, consulting businesses, these can be some that get more scrutiny. You really want to make sure that you're addressing the concerns proactively to show either, you have the licenses, it will be a real and operating business, you have a solid business plan. Filing location and venue are very important. Even though kind of the law and the rules are the same, the way that different consulates interpret it, can be different. And there are some that are really used to seeing large multinational companies that are investing millions of dollars and sending over employees. And for those types of consulates, they're often kind of less, inclined towards the smaller business owner or smaller investor. If they see an investment of 60,000, 80,000, it doesn't seem substantial to them because they're so used to seeing, investments from these huge companies. So you do want to be aware of what are the trends at your filing location. They change because consular officers also change locations over time and trends change. So it is very important, to discuss with your attorney and ask what are the trends at this specific consulate at this point in time. And that's become even more important now because there is less flexibility in where you apply. If you go for a consulate, you will have to apply in either your country of residence or nationality. There's kind of less flexibility with applying in any type of third country. So the next two reasons are, kind of related. So these are related to marginality concerns, which is, are you going to hire workers in the U.S.? So if you've had a business in your home country and it has never had employees, you've been a successful consultant for 10 years with no employees, they may not believe you that you're going to hire someone just on the basis of a business plan. So for that type of application, it can be very helpful to hire somebody before you file just to address that concern up front. Issues with the adjudicating officer. So officers are human beings. They have different levels of training and experience. And, as I said, different consults have different trends of what they will accept. If you do feel like the officer was really off base, there are, limited circumstances where you can try to communicate with the consulate. But generally, the strategy will be to reapply. Most consulates will try to give you a different officer than the first time adjudicator. It's not a guarantee, but they do try to do that. Another might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So sometimes people will file on their own or maybe file with attorneys that aren't as familiar with immigration rules. And, perhaps the treaty country national doesn't own 50%, or the entire deal is seller financing and no money has actually been put at risk. In those cases, you would have to, address whatever the filing concern was, and reapply if possible. Okay, let's talk about some renewals. So, what does it take to renew an E-2 visa? So the biggest things they're going to look at your renewal are your tax returns, the company tax returns, and the W-2s. They really want to see, have you hired U.S. workers? It is really key to hire U.S. workers. There's some very limited situations, where maybe, the business, like a construction business, where you primarily work through subcontractors, or maybe you have very few employees, but you're paying, hundreds of thousands of dollars to subcontractors. In those cases, you can also bring in 1099s, but generally they really want to see, have you hired workers? Are they W-2s? We generally recommend at least 3 to 5, full-time workers if possible. If you have hired that number over the years, but because employees, kind of change and leave jobs, you can explain that as well. So if, let's say you've hired 10 people over the years, but right now you only have a staff of 2, you would still want to mention that. Tax returns, often they ask for 2 years. There are some consulates that ask for like 5 years if you've had a 5-year visa. Is the company profitable? What are the wages that you're paying and the salaries? If the company is not doing well, do you have a plan to turn things around? Do you have any marketing initiatives? Do you have, job, postings out there? So you'll want to bring all of that in, to create a narrative to show if the business is doing well, hey, look at the tax returns and W-2s, we're doing great. And if the business is not doing so well, then you're going to use this opportunity to explain, here's how we're going to get back on track, or here's kind of where things, have been difficult, definitely during COVID, we were doing a lot of that kind of creative explaining, the whole trajectory of the business. Also important to show that the company still meets the E-2 requirements. So ownership, any ownership changes should be disclosed. And it's important to remember that the investor needs to continue to own at least 50% of the company. So if it's fallen below that, that could be a problem. And again, changes to the type of business. So we talked about this in a previous slide, but you are authorized to work for the company, in the industry that you disclose to the consulate and to USCIS. So if there's been a major change to the business, ideally you would have gotten that approved ahead of time. If it's a natural outgrowth of the business or something that you contemplated in your business plan, then you can kind of explain that when you do your renewal. Okay, so let's look at some developments and adjudication trends and considerations. So E-2 visas generally have high approval rates, 80 to 90% as posted by the US government. So that has continued and did continue from 2016 to 2020 as well. So we haven't seen kind of major changes in approvals of E-2 visas during this administration. Investment purchases in the US, it's not required that you make your investment in the United States, but it does help. We think it's favorable. Consular officers will sometimes ask about it. And because the E-2 is really meant to facilitate economic benefit between the US and the treaty country, it's a good idea to spend some money in the United States if you're able to. Um, the government may want higher investment amounts. So this is always going to be the case, but especially right now, investing more is going to be favorable for your application. Hiring U.S. citizens. So Buy American, Hire American was an executive order, from 2016 to 2020. But what it does indicate is that hiring of U.S. citizens is kind of always prioritized. And they will want to see that with your E-2 company. So that should be a priority, as you kind of develop your business and when you put into your business plan, or if you've hired someone before you file, a good idea to hire a U.S. worker. You really want to focus on employees rather than contractors. As I said, 1099s are really going to be brought in only in limited cases where it just makes sense in light of the industry, like construction, where you're going to have, it's very common to have large, subcontractor groups. But really, always you want to have at least a few employees. Administrative processing. So this can mean two things. So administrative processing is when you attend your interview with the consulate, and instead of approving you or denying you, they issue you a Form 221G. And it's a technical denial, but it can be either a request for more evidence. So sometimes they say we want something from you. It's a updated, criminal check, or it's some document that they felt they, needed that they didn't have. In that case, the administrative processing can usually resolve within a few weeks, or a month or so, because the consulate is really able to review the documents and then, decide on the case. You can also be put into administrative processing for kind of security concerns or background checks that are flagged by agencies outside of the consulate. And in that case, it can take much longer for the administrative processing to resolve. They're not asking for anything from you. They're really just waiting for whatever agency has flagged the application to complete their checks and either say, yes, you can go ahead, or no, for some reason, the application can't be granted. So if it's the second one, the timing can stretch out for longer, even months. And so that's something just to be aware of because it is happening more right now in this area, or era of enhanced vetting. So more USCIS filings. This really started kind of during the pandemic where people were less able to travel. But I think now, with some of the issues at the consulates and kind of long wait times and uncertainty, people are, more interested in staying in the United States. And so if they're able to, they may file with USCIS. You just want to keep in mind what we've talked about earlier in the presentation, which is that you cannot travel internationally, with the E-2 change of status, and also that they are, stricter on the source and trail of funds, but they will, are more accepting of lower investment amounts. Longer waits at consulates. So this is really you have to check the consulate that you are applying at because these trends and times just change all the time. And because there has been a lot of change to policy, for example, interview waivers, like longstanding interview waivers for people under 14 and over 79 are no longer available, and everybody has to be interviewed. And so that means there's the same or less officers for, vastly more people that need interviews. So we are seeing longer waits, and you want to plan ahead, as you, plan for your E-2 application.
Okay, that's very helpful and informative presentation. Thank you very much, Kelly. Okay, now let's take a look at questions.
Perfect. So we see here how protection and must be at risk with escrow account. Is a change of status putting me at risk when going in the future to the consulate? I'm not sure what the first part is asking. If you're doing a purchase of a business, you can use something called escrow, where, basically you're going to put the full purchase price of the business into escrow, and the only remaining condition for release of the funds is the approval of the E-2 visa. So that's kind of how escrow works in a purchase situation, and you have to put the full purchase price for the business into escrow. In terms of a change of status putting you at risk when going to the consulate in the future, uh, This really depends. We have many clients who have done this, who have gotten a change of status for the E2 and then gone to the consulate. The important thing to remember is that the consulate is not going to rely on the change of status approval. They're going to make their own determination. If you are at a consulate that is kind of known to be a more difficult consulate and they feel that you entered the US maybe on a tourist visa and we're not upfront about like the reasons for getting the visa, then you can potentially have more problems with the consulate. But it is very viable to have the change of status approved and then go to the consulate. You just have to realize it'd be a completely different application and they're not going to rely on the approval. All right. Can I apply with two businesses at one time? You can. So it is possible to do this. You have to essentially kind of, each business has to independently meet the E2 requirements. It also can be confusing for the consulate. So it is possible, hypothetically, to do this, to get two businesses annotated on your visa. But it can be confusing for the consulate because it's not something they do a lot. So it's possible, but can be complicated. Yonki, do you want to take the next one?
Okay. Does the consultant will ask me about my business in home country? Yes, they could, but it's not always. If in your E2 visa application, they will ask you what kind of career path that you have built in your home countries. So you are basically revealing what you have been doing it. And if there's the same situation, same business that you have been operating in your home country, then yes, they could ask how successful you were doing it and what kind of experience you get it. If your business was very successful in your home country, obviously it will be very good indication that your E2 business in the United States will be also successful. So that's a good part.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And do you want to take this last question?
And I hire us.
A U.S. worker, part-time, not full-time.
Okay. That helps, but obviously it's better than no having no employees at all. But obviously full-time employees also is always better. But sometimes people ask this question: is it better to have two part-time employees versus one full-time employee, which is the same cost? There's no right and wrong answers. It's up to your business. Okay. That's
Perfect.
pretty much all the questions we have. So thank you everyone for taking time to join today's webinar. We hope this session helped clarify key aspects of the E2 visa process and provide practical insight into planning your investment and business strategy. If you would like to discuss your situation in more detail, please feel free to schedule a consultation with us. We would be happy to continue the conversation. Thank you again for your time, and we look forward to speaking with you soon. Bye.
Thank you.